Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the AXR Marketing Director Incubator. My name is Mike Dixon, and I lead the Sales and Marketing Division of AXR Recruitment and Search. Over 20 years as a professional sales and marketing recruiter, my biggest frustration is seeing someone's career slow down before they reach their potential. Too many career conversations, I think, are unproductive, and career decisions narrow rather than expand a career. In the Marketing Director Incubator, we'll discuss why this happens and help future leaders like you to prepare for better career conversations and to make better career conversations. In each session, we're going to learn about a different marketing director's career journey, how they've gained experiences and skills to reach senior leadership. We'll look at their successes, perhaps some of their failures, lessons learned, and big decisions they've faced. I'm delighted today to be joined by Nathan Lowe. Morning, Nathan.
Morning, Mike.
Nathan's General Manager of Marketing and Insights for Meat and Livestock Australia. Nathan's got over 20 years experience in marketing and sales, working with Unilever, Sunrise, Pact Group, Ladbrokes, and MLA, which gives us lots to talk about, and we'll go into Nathan's career as we go through the session. Now, the format, guys, given we've got a number of people on the call today, everyone is automatically muted, but we'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. So be as active as you'd like on the chat facility. I'll just open that now and make sure that we are able to see any of the conversations and questions as we go. We've also got time at the end. I'll have about 10 minutes at the end of the session, which I've got some questions that some of you pre-submitted that we'll address. But again, happy to go through as many of your questions as we've got time for. So let's get into it. And before we get into your career journey, Nathan, a bit about you. So what do you do when you're not being, I'm sure, the very busy general manager of marketing and insights at Meat and Livestock Australia?
Yeah, well, I guess similar to most parents, also when I'm not being a chauffeur for my two young kids.
Yep.
Look, my interests are very much, I love food. So you either find me in a restaurant or a cafe or somewhere sampling, a new coffee place or a new cuisine. I love my sport. I love my racing. So Spring Carnival, we can't do it now during COVID, but you normally find me at the track on a Saturday. And right now I'm actually at a bit of a loss. It's a 2-week period after the NRL season ends where I'm always wondering what I'm going to do for the next few weeks, and summer sport hasn't yet started. But usually that's, and exercising and trying to lead a healthy lifestyle as well.
Excellent. It was some final.
It was, yeah. It was. It was a bit disappointing. I was going for the Panthers.
Yeah,
but,
me too.
That's what happens next year.
Yeah, exactly. Looked pretty good. So you graduated back in '97 with a commerce degree from University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and joined Unilever the same year as in their Future Leaders program. Why FMCG and why Unilever?
Yeah. Look, it's probably hard to explain what FMCG was 20 to 25 years ago. I went to uni and I studied marketing, but working in FMCG and for a multinational like Unilever, that was like where you went to learn how to do marketing. So for me, I was actually graduating to start my real education and how to be a marketer. And FMCG, I mean, it still has that reputation today, but back then it really was the place you wanted to go to learn those core marketing disciplines. So for me, it was almost like I was doing my PhD in marketing, but I was going to do it in the real world. Unilever appealed because they had a number of market leading brands, had a number of brands that I used, so I knew who they were. The hardest thing when you're a graduate is you don't actually know much about half the companies that you're applying for. But Unilever was the one that felt very familiar. And also, back then, you don't put a lot of scientific thought into it. They were bigger in Australia and New Zealand, and part of the graduate scheme is you got at least 2 trips to Australia. So the opportunity to travel on the company also appealed.
It's often the simple things when you're that age. Having run the Sales Director Incubator for a number of months now, a lot of the sales guys talk about the fact that they were offered a car, and as a graduate, that was amazing. It's like, wow, a new car, and the simple things that kind of can influence your decision making back then. But I think concur with I think Unilever is a great choice. Not everyone get in, so a great job for doing that. But I'm curious too. Your first role at the grad program was in brand management, and you then made it your home for the next 15 years at Unilever, and you kind of worked. You got to Australia. South Africa. You added the Middle East and Turkey to your portfolio before taking on a regional marketing director role for Southeast Asia. So that's a pretty impressive career trajectory over that 15 years. I'm curious, how do you build a career like that in a business like Unilever?
Yeah. And look, there's no magic secret. And to be honest, the things that build a successful career in one organization like that are the same things that allow you to build a successful career in any organization or across different organizations. So, it's a commitment to personal development and learning. It's building positive relationships. I certainly wouldn't have had that career journey, particularly across different regions and international markets, if I hadn't built relationships with people globally that became advocates for me. Because often, it's the same organization, but if you're applying for a role in South Africa or the Middle East or Asia, you're talking to people who have never worked with you before, they don't know you. But if you've got networks and relationships within the organization, then you become a trusted commodity or a low risk hire for those roles because people trust the opinion of other people. As well as I think it's also a mindset of actually looking for the opportunity and the challenge. Half those roles I did because they just sounded like a cool role and they were different. I went to South Africa because it was a cool idea to go and work in South Africa and the role was interesting and challenging. And then you do a good job and then build relationships and then other opportunities present themselves. So you've certainly, as long as you're willing to be agile and move and take opportunities and do a good job, those roles sort of, they just come. I certainly didn't set out a plan. I didn't have a spreadsheet of I was going to work for Unilever for 15 years and do all those different things. It was really just being open-minded to the opportunities when they presented themselves and recognizing those opportunities that actually were career developing and added something to, I guess, my skill set or portfolio of skills.
Could you say no to a role at Unilever or if asked, did you have to kind of really take it?
No, you could definitely say no. I mean, you had career development conversations about things you wanted to do and where you wanted to go, and often roles would get presented to you as, hey, these are opportunities that exist today. But if they weren't, if they were in a geography that didn't make sense from a lifestyle perspective, or if it was more of the same and you didn't feel like you were going to be developing your skill set, as long as you had a reason, probably what wouldn't have been acceptable was just saying no because you didn't want to, and not having a valid reason for it. As long as you had a mindset to grow and develop and were clear on what your needs and desires were, it was acceptable to push back on certain things.
Sure. How different is brand marketing a domestic role to an international role? Because your Unilever career transcended both.
Yeah, and I think, look, it depends on the culture of the organisation or the structure of the organisation. So, look, Unilever went through a number of iterations while I was there, and it's gone through a number of more since I left. When I first started in the ANZ team, I mean, we did our own strategy, we did our own innovation development, we did our own creative development. But then halfway through my career, it moved to very much a global, regional versus local structure, and the global and regional teams, which essentially is the international teams, did the strategy and the comms development and the innovation development and a lot of the insights work. And then the local country operating teams executed into the media and the sales development, etc. So that structure made it very different. One was very executional and the other one was very strategic and innovative and creative. Operating in an international market, if you've still got that end-to-end remit, is no different to working in a domestic market. It's really just a collection of a whole series of domestic markets, and you're essentially applying the same disciplines and processes in every country.
Okay. After Unilever, say 15 years, you took on the head of marketing and innovation at Sunrise. Now, Sunrise is a different business. It's an agri business, which is different to a traditional FMCG. From a marketing perspective, does that change the way we should do things?
It does in some sense. So, I mean, again, it depends on the culture of the organisation, and some organisations are very marketing led, others are very sales led, some are very operationally led. One difference in agribusiness is, you know, you're not just selling the blue widget or the red widget and running the factory faster if sales are going up. You know, essentially you're selling a crop. And if it doesn't rain, you don't have crops. So, you know, you don't have as much control over your supply chain. You can't just press a button and get more stock. So culturally, it was very much a supply chain driven organization, as well as you weren't, as a marketer, your job wasn't necessarily just to sell more. It was to sell as much as you can for the highest value. So it sort of changed the strategic role that marketing played within the organization and the type of things that you did. It is certainly weird having to transition your mindset, or slightly challenging when you've spent your whole career and on this about growing volume and growing market share, growing margin, and it's now you're actually making decisions to prioritize markets and not sell stuff in certain places because it's not the highest value destination for that stock. Because essentially in agribusiness, you're representing Australian farmers and your role is to maximize the returns that they get. So you're much more aware of the supply chain impact on the business, which is great. You sort of build your commercial skills, and as a marketer, you get a deeper understanding of sort of the vertical integration of the organization. But it's fun because you're actually getting closer to the factory floor in many respects.
Yeah. It's interesting that point of difference brings me my next question, Nathan. So McKinsey use a model called the T-shaped career. Now this assesses the upward mobility of a leader when they go into an organization to look at capability. And one of the T effectively says, well, an individual has vertical specialization in a function. That's the vertical line. Then they have experiences, which give them breadth, which forms the T. So now you in your career have taken several broadening roles, whether it's at Unilever, we talked about an agribusiness like Sunrise, then you've moved into a business like Pact, which is different again, and Ladbrokes and MLA. So have you set particular goals to create breadth at all during your career?
Probably not consciously. Well, consciously in terms of having an awareness of the need to do it. Not consciously in the sense of sitting down and building a spreadsheet and, you know, mapping out where I wanted to be in 3 to 5 or 10 years. But certainly my approach to my career has always been, whatever the next role I do needs to be adding something in some way. You know, one of the biggest pieces of advice I give to marketers, and it's one of the best pieces of advice I ever got in my career, was actually use your marketing skill set to promote yourself, or think of yourself as a brand. And we spend so much time, you know, on the brands we work on, thinking about points of difference. So for me, I've always tended to think about, well, what's the point of difference of that next role? What extra feature does it give me as a marketing leader? And therefore, it's meant I've actively sought out diverse roles that felt very different to things I've done in the past. Even within Unilever, albeit it felt like 5 different companies across the 15 years because of all of the changes and the different geographies I worked in. Each role was a very different role to the one that I've done before. That for me just felt it was another piece in the pie of building my marketing skill set or my business leader skill set.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that point you make there about thinking of yourself as a brand. It's what I talk to candidates a lot about. I meet people when they are thinking about what next, and part of the purpose of this program is to expand their thinking beyond the linear. So people get very fixated on the next role in front of them, as opposed to actually, how does that build my career, and does that improve my brand proposition in marketing? So we'll come back to that theme a lot as we do this conversation. Now at Pact, you managed sales and marketing, which is challenging I imagine it may be challenging because you hadn't done a sales role before. So you're suddenly in charge of the sales function as well as the marketing function. How did you cope with that?
Yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting sort of 18 months while I was there. And that was actually a very conscious career choice. I'd always considered myself a very commercial marketer. And, and that was actually one of the points of difference for me in terms of how I thought of my career and the type of marketer that I was. So I always had close relationships with sales teams. I always spent a lot of time with customers in any of my marketing roles.
Yeah.
Ironically, Unilever hired me as a sales grad way back when I left
uni.
Okay. Yeah, so and they do all the psychological testing, and you do all these things, and the report spits out, and they go, "You are a sales grad."
Right.
So I spent my 2 years of the graduate scheme.
Testing.
I spent two years of my graduate scheme trying to convince Unilever that I was a marketer.
Right.
And I actually just got very lucky that my boss resigned and I got exposed to senior marketing leaders and did a good job. And there was a marketing role for me when I came off the graduate program. So I always had in the back of my mind that, well, actually, maybe my natural calling is sales. So I always wanted to have an opportunity to test that in my career. That role was a nice way to move into sales because it wasn't a pure sales director role. It was more business development. We were setting up a new division and building a new leadership team within Pact Group. We were bringing 3 companies that they'd acquired together into a single division. So there was a lot of sort of integration work to be done. So it was really about setting up a sales and marketing team, a structure, systems and processes, setting a vision, building a strategy. Those skill sets were the same as what you apply as a marketing director. So it was a lot of what I already knew and was already good at. What I did learn, though, is how critical it is to fill your gaps with really strong leaders around you. So halfway through that role, we encountered very much a perfect storm. Really high rising, unforeseen sort of commodity input price increases or cost increases that significantly impacted our margins. So we needed to pass on price increase to customers, which everyone on the call, I'm sure, knows in this market is very, very difficult, particularly if you're supplying the major retailers. And so that actually required some real hardcore actual sales skills. And for me, that then suddenly was when I felt not so much out of my depth, but felt for the first time in my career, well, I'm actually not prepared for this. I've never done this before. And it was really about jumping in the deep end. And that's when you realize having those skill sets around you to complement and fill out those gaps, and having really good mentors that have experienced that and can give you good advice sort of helps you get through those sort of phases.
Yeah. I think it's in terms of developing commercial capability, I think it's awesome if marketers can get an opportunity to work in sales. And vice versa. I think if you can do the reverse and category, I think also offers that kind of midway.
Yeah, and I wish I had done it earlier in my career. In fact, the regret was that I didn't do that earlier. For me, I mean, there's always I kind of call it a dynamic tension, I think, between sales and marketing. I think businesses perform at an optimal level when there is that dynamic tension between sales and marketing, where they hold each other accountable. We have very high expectations of each other. So, the sales team hold marketing accountable to deliver campaigns that work, innovations that sell, because they've got to please the customer and hit their sales targets. And marketing holds sales accountable to execute well in store and to drive that sales growth, so they're getting a return on investment for all of the money we're putting into R&D and into advertising and media. And that when that tension's healthy, I think that's when you get the best results. Yeah. And having worked on the other side of the fence, I understand where my sales colleagues are coming from a lot better than I ever could have from only having seen it from the marketing side.
Yeah. I think it's a very good point. Moving on to the next phase of your career, you then worked as GM marketing for Ladbrokes, which must have been, well, I assume it's very different from FMCG, was it?
It probably couldn't be further away from FMCG. However, the FMCG skill set actually really adds value in that category. And that was part of my sales pitch to join that organization. it was partly driven by my personal love of racing and sport. So I'd always wanted to work in the wagering sector. Again, thinking of filling out that pie, what am I getting? What am I giving? Certainly what I was getting is experience in e-commerce, working for a tech company, deeper experience in CRM and digital acquisition marketing that I hadn't had the opportunity to do at any other time in my career. And our skills that are becoming increasingly important regardless of what industry you work in. But what I brought to the table in that environment was that rigor and structure and strategy and insight-led stuff, and big brand feel that hasn't necessarily been a huge part of what the wagering industry do, because it's very much retail-led. Our team, we were making probably 30 ads a week with all our various offers around racing and sport, and then you're getting real-time feedback based on how many customers you're acquiring, and then you're adapting your campaigns on the run. So the pace at what you work and how fast response it is, as well as all of your data is your own data. So it's like literally having scan sales on an hourly basis on your desktop. Coming from FMCG, it was like magic. It was like, oh my God, if I had this and every other job I had, I'd be so much more successful and would get such a better return on investment. But what is similar is the rigor around the focus on results and taking action based on data and research, and it's just at a different level because it's a fast-paced retail environment. And fortunately for me, and I think this is probably something for people to consider if they are looking to change industries, or if they've got a vision for where they might want to work in 5 or 10 years, sometimes it needs to be a leapfrog approach. I think if I'd have jumped straight from Unilever to Ladbrokes, the culture shock would have been very difficult, just in terms of the pace of the operation. But because I'd worked for Sunrise, which is very fast-paced, a lot of innovation, you have to be responsive because of the supply chain. Working for Pact Group and having that sales experience, again, obviously sales is very fast-paced. Is it kind of had those moves had prepared me for what working in an e-commerce retail environment would be like. The only time where you could probably make the leap direct is if you were going into a pure head of brand role and you didn't necessarily have sales metrics or KPIs.
There's a question in the chat, which I think, as we talk about the broadening of your career, I think is relevant. Hi, Nathan. Are there any marketing competencies or disciplines around today that weren't around during the early part of your career? If so, how did you build new muscle as a more senior marketing leader?
That's actually a really interesting question. Certainly, I think we need to be more dynamic now than we ever have before. I mean, in the early stages, the leadership competencies haven't changed. I think some of the human competencies have. I think we certainly need to be more resilient today than we ever have been at any other point in our lives. And that has been, certainly resilience training is now a thing that didn't exist in the first 10 years of my career. But equally other things that have changed in a positive way, like the importance of diversity in teams and structures. But if we specifically talk about marketing skills, certainly, to be honest, I don't have any revelations. It's your digital skills, and probably actually justifying ROI. For me, marketing has never been under the microscope more in the boardroom at any other time in history, and the need to be able to justify ROI. So my view now is marketing needs great innovators, great strategists, great creative thinkers. But they absolutely have to be super commercial as well and be able to justify every single dollar that we're spending. So for me, that's probably the biggest change. And if you've got those commercial skills and you can prove the return you're getting on your investment, then you have a very successful career.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Now, not everyone will be familiar with MLA, so it'd be great if you could just give a very brief summary of what MLA does and your mandate there.
Yep, no, it's appreciate the opportunity to share that. So Meat and Livestock Australia is actually a service provider to the red meat and livestock industry. So our remit is essentially we run research and development and marketing programs to benefit producers and processors within the red meat industry. So our job is essentially to drive productivity, profitability, sustainability, and growth of sheep meat, beef, veal, and goat meat, domestically and abroad. And we run a number of initiatives and programs across various divisions of the organisation, from integrity systems that trace product from paddock to plate, through to science and innovation programs that develop new uses for carcass utilisation or new innovation opportunities for red meat. We do a lot of research, consumer research and market intelligence research, in identifying high value markets around the world, as well as then marketing programs to stimulate growth and consumption of mostly beef and sheep meat.
Right, great, okay. A question we'll ask all the marketing directors on the program is the transition from working at a operational level to working more strategically. Mm-hmm. Can you identify when that actually happened for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because, to be honest, I kind of feel like I've always thought strategically. For me, the transition is more actually when it goes from being operational to then the largest part of your job is delivering through other people. It's that transition to leadership. I think in many ways, a lot of marketing is strategic in its nature. That's why we're not sales.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's part of every marketing role. And yes, there's certain times the remit of the role will change, and you're doing a turnaround plan, or you're developing a new 5-year strategy. I just happen to find myself throughout my career, and this goes all the way back to 2000, where almost every role I went into had either a turnaround component to it or a new 5-year strategy. So I feel like that's something that's always been there. But for me, the big transition was sort of the day I realized, I actually don't do anything anymore. Other people do stuff, and my role is to actually drive effectiveness and engagement and optimization of the output of my team. That's the bit where you really feel the cultural change and the need to pivot it and adapt. And for me, that was when I went to Sunrise, because even though I'd done marketing director roles in Unilever, in those sort of regional global teams, you're part of a small team. You're actually still quite hands-on. You're parachuting into individual markets and spot fires or turnaround strategies, and you're partnering with local country teams. So you're still rolling your sleeves up. Whereas at Sunrise, it was actually about building a new culture for the marketing team. It was actually about driving, embedding sort of insight-led, brand-led thinking within the business. And really, it was actually more about delivering through other people and upskilling them and setting a vision and really just clearing roadblocks and making sure that everyone else had what they needed to deliver, because you actually didn't have time to do that and get your hands dirty and be operational. And that's a hard transition to make, because I work in marketing because I love marketing. I love developing new innovation. I love talking to consumers. I love whiteboarding sessions. I love developing campaigns. I love sitting with the media agency and having those conversations. And then when the day comes where you're not meant to do that anymore, that's not the most effective use of your time. It's actually really hard holding yourself back from the stuff that you really enjoy.
Yeah, I think that's probably common in a lot of functions when people move to leadership and realizing that moment actually, it's not my role anymore. So what's next in your career?
Well, look, to be honest, I've only been at MLA for 3 months, so that's a relatively. I'm very much focused on that. I think there's a huge opportunity for the red meat industry. The industry itself has set a goal to double the value of sales of Australian red meat globally by 2030.
Wow.
So there's a very stretching goal there. We're well funded. We've got a great team of people. So for me, I'm not looking any further beyond that. It's exciting doing an industry role, a role that's very much about leadership and strategy. And I feel like there's enough stretch and career development in that. I'm leading a team that's twice the size of any other team I've led previously in my career. So for this part of my leadership journey, that's certainly given me the growth I need in that space. It's a more diverse team than I've ever had in the past. as well as I get to play to a lot of my strengths and build on experiences that I've had in the past as well. So I feel like it's a great mix of the both worlds. And probably my advice for some of the people online around that is sometimes it's easy to look past too far ahead when the right thing to do is actually just focus on the here and now. Have a general idea of where you want to go and the type of skills you want to build. For me, certainly I'd love to move into general management sometime in the future of my career. But for now, I'm focused on doing a great job on what I'm doing, learning from it, and knowing that if I do those things, those opportunities will present themselves.
Yeah, for sure. Great. We touched earlier on you mentioned mentors and surrounding yourself by the right people, and we'll go into career path support in our next section. Do you have a mentor or a coach that you work with?
I've worked with executive coaches in the past. No one person that I've worked with sort of extensively, on a longitudinal basis throughout my career. And I haven't necessarily had formal mentors. I've had a lot of mentors throughout my career, but a lot of them probably didn't realize they were mentoring. It's identifying people that I admired, that I looked up to, that I saw as successful in one way or another. And trying to figure out what made them successful and talking to them about what made them successful and how they approached things and how they led or why they did certain things that way. And just capturing all of those learnings. I kind of consider myself now as a leader as a bit of a Frankenstein of every influential leader I've kind of been exposed to on the course of my career. I'm not sure I actually have any original ideas. And I even catch myself doing things sometimes. I'm like, oh, okay, I got that from blah, 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 or I got that from blah, blah, blah. But that's the sort of, what's the classic sort of model for personal and professional development, right? It's 70% on the job training, 20% coaching and mentoring, and 10% formal courses and training. I try to take that 70% on the job approach to my coaching and mentoring as well.
Yeah. We touched before on advice, and you mentioned a piece of advice that from a career point of view you've settled on. More specifically, has there been a piece of advice that's really shaped you professionally before?
Look, there's probably 3 pieces of advice actually, and we might be covering off something you want me to leave the folks with at the end, so I'll sort of cover it off now. But 3 big pieces of advice that I've had throughout my career that I sort of live by. One was actually the first piece of advice I got from my first ever marketing line manager, and it's more a skill set piece of advice, which is just focus on the objective. And anyone who's ever worked for me, if they're online, will actually laugh because they will have heard me say this in 1,000 meetings over the course of my career. As marketers, we get excited by shiny new toys, and it's very easy to get distracted. The best piece of advice that saved me a lot of wasted energy and time is actually just to always stay focused on the objective. And it's great career advice too. It's very easy to be seduced by an exciting offer, or it's very easy to be seduced by an ex-boss or a friend that's got something for you that might pay a little bit more. But if it's not taking you on that journey to your objective, it's probably not the right decision. And the same as anything we're doing in marketing. If the campaign it might be a fantastic advertising idea, but if it's actually not meeting the objective of the brand, then it's not a fantastic advertising idea right now for you. The other bit of advice that I touched on earlier, but it is incredibly effective, and it's helped me shape the way I think about my career, is that bit around treating yourself like a brand. And it's not something I consciously do, because to be fair, you'd be a bit of a wanker if you walked around and actually presented yourself like a brand. But it's more, everyone on this call is a great marketer in their own way. They spend a lot of time honing their craft and skill set for the brands and categories that they work on. But it amazes me how often people don't apply those same skills to themselves, particularly through, say, an interview process or a recruitment process. Treat the organization or the hiring manager like a consumer. And what are their needs? What are their wants? What are their desires? What are your insights into what they need? And then what's your unique selling proposition to what they need? You can apply the same thing to writing your CV. Rather than listing achievements, think about what's the story I want to tell? What's my brand story? because we've actually all got those skills. It's actually, in fact, when I started to think about things like recruitment and CVs and job search with that lens, it actually made it infinitely easier for me, because I could just rely on stuff that I did every day and was a core strength. So that, think of yourself like a brand, and all the attributes of actually what you do, from insight development to building a brand proposition, even having a brand vision plan from where are we today, where do you want the brand to be in the future, and then what are the steps to get there. You can think about your career in a very similar way. And then from a marketing and advertising perspective, well, that's your CV, and that's how you sell yourself through an interview process, or actually just networking and how you interact with people. So I think there's a lot of parallels there. And then the other piece of advice is just really the importance of networks and relationships. I mean, probably young marketers today are probably more connected than people were when I first started my career, because of social media and that sort of thing. We didn't have LinkedIn back then. So it was actually harder to build networks. You actually had to physically meet with people and go for coffees with people. But also just be mindful of everything's a relationship, everyone you come in contact with. I think half the jobs I've got in my career were actually not always directly a result of someone I knew, but people I knew and people within my network indirectly helped me get some of those roles, either because they were a reference, or actually because they're an advertising agency I worked with 5 years ago that are the advertising agency for the company I'm going for a job, and they get called up and asked about me before I've even gone in for an interview. So you just never know where those relationships are actually going to be beneficial and help you. So you can't do it alone. You need those people around you.
Great advice. I get constant feedback from all levels of people, HR, CMOs, but also those who are in junior to mid-career, that career conversations or appraisals are pretty, they're combative. They're not that productive, and part of the reason I'm running this program is to try and raise the bar and raise awareness so people prepare better for those conversations. How do you think somebody should prepare for a career conversation? They've got an appraisal coming up, or the development conversation coming up. How should they prepare?
Yeah. So firstly, I think for me, they do add a lot of value if they're done the right way. I think the important thing to think about is they don't exist in a vacuum. And they actually aren't a point in time. I mean, these things should actually be ongoing. So I've always been an advocate for quarterly check-ins or ongoing check-ins with your team. These conversations should never be a surprise. They are always a surprise if they're only held once a year and they're done to tick a box because the organization's processes say it has to be done. But for me, the best way to approach them, particularly for a young aspiring marketer, is your career journey is actually, you own it. It's up to you. The organization you work for won't own that career journey. You'll have great line managers that actually help and support you, and organizations that will have opportunities for you, but you've really got to take ownership of it yourself. And when I say it doesn't exist in a vacuum, is that career conversation needs to be aligned to a number of other things that form a broader conversation. So one is, the role that you're doing and what are the core skills, essentially what's the work plan, what are your KPIs, what's the development plan that actually supports your ability to develop those KPIs, but then what's the development plan that actually sets you up to take that next step you want to take in your career. So for me, there's two components to anyone's development plan. I talk about these things with people who work for me. There's the part of the development plan that's for today, and then which is probably more skill building, and then there's the part of the development plan that's for tomorrow. And that tomorrow really shouldn't be what I think it should be. It should be what the individual wants and needs and where they want to go with their career. Now, sometimes those two things aren't aligned, and that's okay. That conversation should be had, and it should be out in the open, and then you should be able to come to a resolution around what you do about it. Because there's some people who want to work in sales, and they'll be like, well, there's no opportunities in sales, and actually we don't think that's a great fit for you. And those are still positive conversations to be had, because that person then has a choice. of, well, if I stay with this organization, I know it's only in marketing and I've got a choice to look outside externally because I'm potentially not going to be happy, or work through the process of why does the organization view me that way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of conversations that have a lot of richness and a lot of value that can be had within that process, but it's not a one-time tick, once a year tick the box, because it's a review of your performance that then links to your remuneration or your bonus. It's iterative and ongoing.
Yeah, I think in my experience, I meet people obviously every day who are meeting me because they are thinking of doing something different. And it's always surprises me how few people are prepared to have a really strong conversation with a defined career narrative. They come to me often looking for too much direction. I'm happy to challenge and I'm happy to kind of guide and advise, but it's very difficult to do that if the individual is coming to me out of frustration only, or with a purely open mindset of what they might do next. I think specific goal setting is important, and being clear on what your narrative is. You talk in terms of seeing yourself as a brand. I think that's really important because that helps you define the explanation of what you stand for and what your USP is, and what you want to take to market. And I think more people spending time on building that career narrative in those terms, I think that'd be one of the best pieces of advice they can take from this session, I reckon. Every marketing director we'll have in the program has a different career path, and that's the whole point, is that nobody has followed this linear route to the top of the profession, which I think surprises sometimes people in junior roles, because they see the career being built in that fashion, but it just isn't. We mentioned earlier how your path typifies McKinsey's T-shaped career, and as a professional sales and marketing recruiter, I know that a candidate that has experiential breadth is more likely to make a shortlist than one who's simply just a functional expert. What broadening experiences or roles impressed you when looking at a resume, or whether that's an internal or external candidate you're looking at for a particular role?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really hard one to answer in terms of specifics, because it depends on the nature of the role. It also depends on what you're looking for your team, because quite often, there's 100 candidates that have the skill set, but you're looking for a particular cultural fit, or actually you're looking for, even sometimes the opposite to a cultural fit. You're looking to add some diversity to your team, and so what you're tending to look for is, I'm not just looking for breadth of experience and diversity of experience, but I'm actually looking to understand who they are. Because certainly anyone who gets through a recruiter or gets through a shortlist and makes it to an interview with me, my starting point is that they've all got the skills for the job. So I'm not actually looking to explore necessarily the skill set and experience. What I'm looking for is how they think. Is that going to gel with myself and the organization? So it's actually more how they tell their story. Why have they done the roles that they've done? What did they learn from those roles? How did that add to their skill set? Why did they make the career choices that they've made? And then what sits under that is, then the hardcore skill sets and achievements, and what role did you play, and all the standard interview questions. But for me, it's actually, I'm looking that they understand themselves, and that even if they didn't have a career plan and a personal strategy, that there's some method to the madness, there's some intent to it, or even there's an understanding looking back, that self-awareness and that introspection as to why they did things and what they gained from that. I don't particularly have a preference one way or the other as to whether someone's worked 10, 15 years for one organization, or they've worked, they've had 5 3-year stints in 5 different organizations. I actually don't necessarily say one or the other's wrong, but it's more, has each of those been growth? What concerns me when I look at a CV is if there's 5 3-year moves and they're all at the same job. And it's actually okay if some of them have all been at similar levels. I'm just looking for, how did it add to their skill set? How do they fill out that pie? Because for me, that's what makes a really impressive sort of mid to senior level marketer.
What's the converse? What can frustrate you when meeting somebody? They don't meet expectations on paper, for instance, or they they behave in a particular way in an interview? What are the watch outs?
The most important bit of advice I can give, if it's a specific piece of advice for interviews, and to be honest, it's actually just probably the best bit of leadership advice I've ever been given, is just be authentic. We're hiring a person. We're not hiring a spreadsheet or some bullet points on a piece of paper. So I'm looking for the human side. I'm looking for that self-awareness, because that sort of, as I said before, largely by the time I get to meet someone, everyone I'm meeting has the skills for the job. So I'm largely looking for cultural fit, and I can't assess cultural fit from a piece of paper or even a list of achievements. I can assess cultural fit from how they talk, how they behave, who they are. And if you're not authentic, you can't get a sense of that. So for me, the single biggest frustration for me is people who are robotic in that environment. Now, sometimes I must say, I'll take responsibility as an interviewer. Interviewers need to create a safe environment, a comfortable environment for people to actually be able to share. But for me, that's the most important thing. Is by the time you get to a second or a third round interview, by then it's usually all about cultural fit.
I think it's a really good point around authenticity, and it's an overused word, but I think if you take a step back and try and understand it, it's about being able to express yourself in terms that don't involve wearing this kind of suit of armor in an interview that shows you're invincible, because nobody is. We talked earlier about the ability to build resilience. We've had to deal with so many setbacks in the past year. But when I meet somebody and talk about their development areas or what they do when things go wrong, very few people are prepared to really show themselves in those questions. And they give a very polished answer that spins it right back to the positive again, which is not real, because life doesn't work like that. And I'd far rather people were prepared to kind of actually unveil a difficult scenario about how they work through it and what they learn from it.
And actually, I'll loop back to the theme of what I said before around think of yourself like a brand. From an advertising perspective, we spend a lot of time talking about memorability and cut through. You give those answers in an interview, the hiring manager won't remember you. He's interviewed 4 people back to back. If you give a cookie cutter answer, or you turn something around to a positive, but a human story, particularly if it's around those areas of what you've learned or failures that you've had, or and you're able to articulate that in a very human sort of way, that's memorable in an interview process. That helps you stand out. So again, think of yourself like a brand. It's about cut through and recall, and what are the stories you can tell, what are the features of your career you can talk about that someone will remember when they're sitting down with the HR manager the next morning in the 15 spare minutes they've got in the middle of a busy day. You want to be the person that they remember.
Great. Let's move on to some of the questions that have come through in the chat, and we've got a bunch that have been supplied previously as well. So there's a few interesting ones there if my eyesight's good enough. So you're 3 months into your role, Nathan. This is a good one, actually. How do you plan your priorities for the first 3 months in a new role?
That's actually a great question, because to be honest, earlier in my career when I changed roles, I didn't think that deeply about that. I kind of probably just jumped in and started working. But the more you transition to leadership, and particularly senior leadership, you really need to put some structure around that. So for me, I actually sat down and I did genuinely map out a 30-day, 60-day, and a 90-day plan. And as well as to a certain level, I articulated what that plan was to my line manager, who was the MD of the business, to make sure I was doing what he wanted me to be doing. There's no point having your own plan if it's not what your boss wants you to do. And actually, it was broken up into really succinct chunks, right? So first 30 days was shut up and listen. So meet everyone, ask questions, but just listen. The whole you've got 2 ears, 1 mouth type thing. You know nothing in the first month. So that was very much around that. Just learn, listen, get the hang of the business, start building relationships. And that was important to align with my line manager, because it meant I wasn't going to do anything. in my first month. I literally was not going to do any work for the first 30 days. So that's also important to align that he doesn't expect me to do any work in the first 30 days. And then 60 days is then around, based on everything I learned, start developing some ideas and some themes and a vision for the team and the processes and changes I might want to implement and make, and get that aligned with sort of my senior leadership peers and some of the senior leaders in my own team. And then the third set of 30 days is the 90-day plan, starting to action that and implement it. And when you sort of break it down in those chunks, it actually becomes very manageable. And I've got to the end of my 3 months now.
Yeah.
And we have a vision for our marketing team. It's aligned with my senior leaders, and we're in the process of rolling that out across the broader marketing and insights group. And probably the other part of the first 30 days that I didn't say, beyond just the listening and meeting people, is it comes back to that authentic leadership. People need to see you as a human. So those first 30 days were really important. I made a point of having a coffee with every single person in my team. Now, I'm not advocating that for everyone. That's sometimes not that easy to do. It sometimes meant I was having 3 coffees a day. So by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was a maniac because of the amount of caffeine I was consuming.
Yeah.
But it was important because it meant people it built trust and credibility, and people saw me as a person and not necessarily as this person coming in and trying to execute change because he's got these ideas that he's just employing from other places he worked at.
Yep, great. Nathan, you mentioned early on it was difficult to evaluate organizations as a graduate when you were picking Unilever. How have you done this later on in your career while deciding to move to a different organization?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question as well. It happens organically. So if you're building relationships, invariably, without realizing it, you actually have a lot of people in your network that have a lot of knowledge about every single industry that you could potentially be wanting to work in. Certainly in marketing, when we're exposed to media agencies, advertising agencies, social agencies, PR agencies, research agencies, they're all doing work across multiple sectors and multiple industries. And if you've got great relationships with your partners in those organizations, they can give you insights into that. As well as the standard things you do with your own research. And Mike, I'll give you a plug here. It's, recruiters are a great source of advice in that space as well, either within your industry, but across industries as well. They can give you advice around things that, you potentially can't get from within your own network, like as in what industries are hiring, what sort of roles are opening, what are their long-term risks because it's going through a phase of downturn or downsizing. So that's great insights that you can really only get from actually engaging and building a network of recruiters as well.
Yeah, great. And it's interesting, actually. I reckon 80% of the conversations I have with people are not about get me a job. They're about what's going on in the market. What's happening, what trends do you see, or what's this organization like, culturally, what is the leadership group like? We recruiters like me who are specialized in a particular function, my world, the consumer world, and I get to know quite a bit about each organization and the leaders involved, and I'm very happy to kind of share that information freely. So quite happy to take calls guys from time to time. It doesn't have to be looking for a job.
But it genuinely actually is important because sometimes the opportunities aren't there at the time you want them.
Yeah,
and if you've got a plan and you want to know where you go, sometimes the timing just isn't right. So, for anyone who is from FMCG, it's cyclical. So I remember phases where, for a 2-year period, every bank aggressively went after, or fintech company aggressively went after FMCG people.
Yep.
Then I had a phase where I decided I wanted to get into banking, and it was, no, we've got too many FMCG people. We're not looking for your skill set right now. So the timing's not right. Yeah. Same with, alcohol at one point in time was filled up with all ex FMCG people. And they're like, well, we've got too much of that skill set. We need diversity. So they're looking for people with other backgrounds.
Yeah.
Wagering historically filled up with, retail and digital marketers. Now through regulation, it's harder and harder to acquire customers through retail-led promotions. It's becoming much more of a brand game, which means now actually FMCG skill sets appeal to that sector because of the experience with insights and strategy and building long-term brand health. So you really only get those insights from reaching out to the market and talking to people like yourself.
It's a really good answer, and it probably partially answers another question, which is how likely, or I guess easy is it to move across industries in the Australian market? And it probably depends on the cycle.
Yeah, and it's entirely skill set driven, right? It's what skill set is that industry looking for, or are the organisations in that industry looking for at that point in time? And it's finding the right timing. So for me, leadership skills are transferable. All the core marketing skills are transferable. I mean, my career has proven that. I've worked in food, I've worked in home and personal care, I've worked in multiple regions around the world. I've worked in e-commerce, wagering, retail marketing. I've worked for a contract manufacturing business in Pact. All of them are incredibly different. And so the way I see it is, if I can do all those different jobs, anyone can work in any industry, but the timing's got to be right. And it's got to be, how does that skill set translate to what they want at that point in time? And accepting that the point in time might not fit when you want to make that move. So sometimes patience really is a virtue when it comes to career planning.
Couple of pre-prepared questions as well, or pre-submitted, I should say. What's the first thing you do when you suffer a setback?
It's
things don't go.
It's funny. I don't like saying this because I've had a few roles where I've kind of ended up in the eye of the storm. But I actually really enjoy it. I actually don't mind a crisis. I prefer not to have them. But for me, what the best leaders do in a crisis is that clarity of thought. That resisting the tendency to act now. Because everyone around you is looking for action really fast if there is a crisis. But the risk is you do the wrong thing and it makes things worse. And everyone else is panicking. So particularly if you're a marketing leader and everyone is actually looking at you for how they should model. So it's like when you hit turbulence in a plane. Every passenger looks at the stewardess to see if the stewardess is panicking. If the stewardess isn't panicking, then everyone sort of relaxes. It's the same with managing a crisis and in the business environment. They're looking to the leader of the team to judge, should I be freaking out? And if people are freaking out, they're not going to think clearly. So really all I do is actually just stay calm, get everyone in a room. Anyone who's worked for me would know I love a whiteboard, and we'll just systematically, calmly map it out. What's the issue? What's our objective? What are we going to do about it? Who's going to do those things? You go and do this, you go and do that, you go and do this. As long as everyone's got something to focus on and they're clear and it clears the noise away, to me, that's the best way to approach that sort of situation. It sounds very clinical, but I think as a leader, you have to be clinical in those type of situations when you have a setback, whether it's a crisis or a career setback, which is more emotional and more personal. But the best way to deal with it is, again, be clinical, take a step back, think through what's the issue, what do I need to do next?
Maybe it's a Kiwi thing.
Why is that?
Jacinta.
Well, we do have I don't want to get into politics, Mike. Politics is a very dangerous space to be.
She seems to do well in a crisis, so
she does.
That's been awesome. I think we're only a couple of minutes before 9, Nathan. So we'll wrap it up there. Thank you for giving us your time and sharing your journey.
No, my pleasure. Hopefully, someone's found it useful.
I'm sure they have. Guys, we're going to hear from a real diverse group of leaders on the Marketing Director Incubator who will, I hope from today's conversation, start to equip you with the knowledge to raise a level of conversation you're able to have about careers, to challenge yourself, to think about your narrative, to think about your own personal brand, as Nathan puts it, which evolves your thinking, decision-making beyond the next role in front of you, but to think more about career terms and how you're building those experiences to create longevity in your career. Now, we tried to get through all the questions we could today. We addressed, I think, most of the questions in the chat. There's a few I didn't manage to get to in terms of the pre-submitted questions, but if you have any follow-ups, please send them to me. That's just to mike@axr.com.au or to Hazel, who's been communicating with you. Now, in finishing, I look forward to seeing you all in the next session, which is in 2 weeks on the 12th of November. We've got Megan Farquhar, who is the Global Marketing Director of JDE. Now, she's actually based in the Netherlands, which is phenomenal. She's agreed to be part of the session. I think it's midnight her time she's dialing in, so it'd be great to see her, so don't miss that. For those of you who resonate, the top point Nathan mentioned around sales and understanding that positive tension between sales, feel free to jump onto the Sales Director Incubator as well. That's been running for a few months, but if you register for that or you're interested, then drop us a note. We can give you the link for that, and that will give you access to all the back interviews we've had as well as the interviews we've got coming up. So feel free. You don't have to just sit in the Marketing Director Incubator. You're welcome to join the Sales Director Incubator as well. So once again, thanks everybody for joining us today, and thanks again to Nathan for being our guest. And guys, have a great Thursday and rest of your week.